On the 20th of October 1986, Aeroflot Flight 6502, a Tupolev TU-136 was en route from Koltsovo Airport to Grozny Airport with a stopover at Kuromoch Airport in Samara. The domestic flight was carrying 87 passengers and 7 crew members. The journey from Koltsovo to Kurumoch was uneventful, with no issues reported. The weather was good and the plane was functioning perfectly. At the approach to Kurumoch Airport, the pilots were instructed by the controller to fly an NDB approach to the runway. Unbeknownst to anyone, this flight would end in a tragic event. In comparison to an ILS approach, the NDB approach can be more challenging. When executing an ILS approach, the instruments will clearly indicate your position in relation to the correct glide path. You will know if you're too high, too low, or if you're off to the side of the runway. With an NDB approach, you only get lateral guidance and there is no single instrument that provides all the essential information. To execute an NDB approach, you need to use the automatic direction finder to tune the NDB beacon, among other things. Basically, an NDB approach is more complex than an ILS approach. If pilots had to choose, they would likely opt for an ILS approach every time. The pilots began to descend into Kurumoch at 3:51 p.m. During the flight, they talked about visibilities. The captain insisted and suggested landing the plane in zero visibility without the autopilot. Surprisingly, the first officer agreed. The captain asked the flight engineer to draw the cockpit window blinds and was determined to land the plane using only instruments, without looking out the window. The modern airplanes allow landing in zero visibility, provided the pilots are appropriately trained and have the right equipment on the ground. However, the pilots in this instance neither had the suitable equipment nor were in a position to land in zero visibility. Of course, this didn't stop the captain. The pilots flew the Tu-134 blindly while the jet was traveling at about 160 knots. Soon, they reached the decision height, which is the point where you should go around if you don't have the runway in sight. The captain recklessly continued the approach, and none of the other pilots objected. What started as a joke had gone too far, but no one spoke up. As the plane lost altitude, the ground proximity warning came on, indicating to the pilots that they were too low. They should have gone around, but they didn't. The captain was struggling to maintain the plane on the correct glide path and pulled back power on the engines to prevent the plane from overshooting the runway. The aircraft touched down well beyond the intended area of the runway. As the captain requested the flight engineer to open the curtains, sunlight flooded into the cockpit, momentarily blinding the pilots and causing a delay in transitioning to visual flight. By the time the pilots were able to regain visual orientation, they realized they were dangerously close to the end of the runway. Within a second of the curtains being opened, Flight 6502 made a hard landing almost 132 meters, 400 feet, past the end of the runway, resulting in severe structural damage to the aircraft. Analysis of the data just before touchdown revealed that the pilots attempted to lift the aircraft out of the descent, but their efforts were futile. The aircraft continued along the runway, and the ruptured fuel tanks ignited upon impact. Upon reaching the end of the runway, the aircraft's fuselage flipped over and skidded 528 meters, 1,700 feet, continuing to burn. 70 people perished in the accident. While the captain, first officer and flight engineer initially survived, the first officer later died from smoke inhalation while trying to rescue other survivors. The crash was so terrifying that authorities wanted to keep photos from getting out, but inevitably the photos were made public. There is not much to break down in this crash. It was not caused by a chain of events that were too complex or the right failures occurring. Instead, it was because of one person's poor choice. Now, why would someone make such a terrible choice? It's probably due to normalcy. This flight, like those before, it had pilots thinking that nothing bad would happen. They most likely thought that since nothing had happened before, it would not happen now. In this way, the false sense of security feeds overconfidence bias for the captain. Overconfidence bias is often observed in the corporate world. This bias occurs when individuals overestimate their skills. In this case, the captain overestimated his ability to operate the aircraft and believed he could land without visual cues. Individuals affected by overconfidence bias tend to act before asking questions, which is precisely what happened here. Despite receiving several GPWS alerts and other warning systems, the captain failed to consider that he might be flying the plane into the ground. The realization only occurred a second before touchdown, when the pilot made a significant nose-up input to avoid a hard landing. Unfortunately, individuals with overconfidence bias rarely pause to ask themselves, what is the worst that could happen? If someone in the cockpit had asked that question, perhaps they would have raised concerns. The astonishing thing wasn't just that the captain proposed landing the plane blindly, but also that the other pilots in the cockpit agreed to his reckless plan. This suggests that Aeroflot had serious safety issues at that time, which is supported by their safety record. There were 8,231 fatalities in Aeroflot crashes, which was about 5 times higher than any other airline at the time. The number of crashes at Aeroflot from the 1950s to the 1990s was so high that Wikipedia created separate dedicated pages for each decade due to the sheer volume of accidents. At the time, Aeroflot was one of the world's largest airlines, carrying about 60 million passengers, while Pan Am transported about 11 million. This large scale, combined with old, unreliable Soviet equipment and unprofessional pilots, proved to be a dangerous combination. On this channel, the goal is to provide an unbiased perspective on events. When pilots make mistakes, the reasons behind their decisions are explored to understand their actions. In this particular case, there are no excuses. It's baffling why the captain acted as he did, despite hours of analysis. The captain's actions in this crash defy logic. Although initially sentenced to 15 years in prison, his sentence was later reduced to 6 years. The tragedy remains that the reckless actions of one individual resulted in the deaths of 70 people, which is almost unbelievable. Yet a positive outcome is that Aeroflot has significantly improved over the past few decades. They now operate a smaller fleet, but are highly rated and much safer. Have you flown Aeroflot recently? What are your thoughts on them? Additionally, why do you think the captain made such a deadly decision? Share your thoughts in the comments below.